I will begin by this quotation of maybe one of the most famous poets in 16th century France, Pierre de Ronsard, who, at the outbreak of the wars of religion, mocked the desire of the Calvinists to convert the kingdom to their faith, ironically calling on them to go and try to implant their beliefs among the pagan peoples. As he wrote, faith is the proof, go to the, maybe I will, this. Go to the region that have not heard of our religions, in Peru, Canada, Calicut, cannibals, there show by effect your Calvinistic virtues. So Peru, Canada, Calicut, and cannibals, Ronsard refers here to toponyms that are largely new to the French language, referring to American and Asian spaces, and to territories that were in part explored by the French at that time, such as Canada or the Brazil for the cannibals, but also by the Iberian powers such as Hispanic Peru and Calicut, where Vasco da Gama's first fleet arrived in the end of the 15th century. If Ronsard chooses these place names for the poetic and assonance and alliteration they allow, he also selects them as toponyms that are both evocative enough for a reader of his time, while at the same time surmounting up a dose of the exotic and the strange. Toponymy is an essential dimension of literary works because of its power to set landmarks and the stimulation of imagination it provides. Obviously, toponymy is also an essential task for the cartographer, who must at the same time list toponyms, place them, but also select them in order to prioritize information. At the beginning of the modern era, the number and origin of place names exploded for Europeans, notably through their expansion around the globe. The settlement, conquest, and colonization of parts of the globe went hand in hand with the naming and mapping of territories, enriching the toponymic repertoire of the creator of literary works. Notably, for example, for imagining routes for the peregrination of their characters. In doing so, these literary writings propose their own literary cartographies, which contribute to the routing of the toponymic repertoire and its dissemination in society. Our paper will examine more specifically the role of translation in 16th century France in relation to exotic and distant toponymy, in order to show the extent to which exchange on a European scale contributed to a new geographical culture. To this end, we will examine the link between cartographic, literary, and historical works, since the chronicles of the Portuguese and Spanish conquest are one of the essential factors in the circulation of these toponyms. Moreover, the modern period does not draw a watertight line between literature and history, especially if we think of travel writing, for example, but also if we think of the actors who are often involved in the production of historical and literary works. In the limited time of a presentation, my proposal will try to show how this circulation favored the emergence of certain places and toponyms, explaining their frequent mobilization. In this paper, I will focus on two emblematic places, a city and a region used by Ronsard, namely Calicut and Peru. So Calicut refers to the city of Kozhikode on the Malabar coast in southwest of present India. A merchant city open to great trade since antiquity, it became the seat of a state during the late Middle Ages, which extended along the coast. Its wealth and reputation explain why it was the destination of Vasco da Gama's fleet, which docked there in 1488, leading to a period of tension and conflict with the Portuguese, who decided to install their capital in Goa, nearby. Although the name of Calicut was not absolutely new for 16th century Europeans, its fame is explained by the arrival of the Portuguese. And even though the city's actual commercial weight declined in the first decades of the 16th century because of the Portuguese competition, Calicut became a shorthand for the whole of the Indies through the Renaissance. So the humanist Barthélemy Hanot published a novel entitled École. As in many of these productions, his hero, Frangal, undertakes a partly marvelous peregrination that takes him around a large part of the world. In one passage, Frangal explained that, crossing Arabia and the lands near the Red Sea, I passed along the kingdoms of Goa, Cananor, and came to Calicut. Barthélemy Hanot was familiar with this place, having edited the French translation of Thomas More Utopia, which referred to a voyage of Calicut. Even though he specifies in his novel that the geography of his hero travels does not necessarily follow spatially plausible routes, Hanot did use maps to imagine this route, in particular those accompanying Sébastien Münster Cosmographia Universalis, translated into French in 1552. This geographical compilation offers not only names of places, but also adds to fix the reference of Calicut, because on the general map of the world, Calicut is the only name appearing for the whole of India, while the other names are also mentioned in the map specifically for Asia. And we can see that it's the three names taken by Hanot. This fixation work is found in other maps of the time that circulated in France, such as those accompanying the world map of cosmography, Appian cosmography, published in French in 1544 and then largely reprinted, where a single toponym accompanies the territorial ensemble marked by the term India. I'm sorry. So also we can see Calicut is the only almost only toponym for the India Peninsula. And the description is that it's the main place for spice. It's also found in the translation of travel accounts of the Indies, notably integrated into geographical compilation. One of the first occurrences of this editorial scheme appeared in the beginning of the 16th century in Italy with the title Paesi novamente ritrovati. This collection of travel writings and geographical text was translated into Latin and then in French in 1515 with this title, The New World and Navigation, made by Émeric de Vespucci, two countries and islands newly found before, unknown to us, both of Ethiopia and Arabia, Calicut, and other several foreign regions. Calicut appears as the only name referring specifically to East Indies, assimilated to previously unknown spaces. Other cases of this translation, it's, for example, in 1556, the partial translation of the first volume of Ramusio Navigazioni et Viaggi, one of the most important compilation of travel writing of this time, appeared in French. The first volume, focused largely on the arrival of various Europeans in the Indian Ocean, and the translation reinforced the central role of Calicut in the ensemble. For example, while in the Italian account of Vasco da Gama's first voyage, there is an alternative writing in which indication about the city alternate with the account of events, the translator decided to redraw the text by merging and grouping the scattered ethnographic notation into a single section, separating them from the event narrative. The paragraph is introduced in such a way as to allow the reader to orient himself to find a coherent, unified, and unique picture of Calicut, which is not in the original text as it's done. So the translation here proceeds in an invisibility manner, to use Lawrence Venuti terminology, as it does not mention that this grouping of disparate elements into a single subset comes from several different accounts of the early East Indian voyages. In another passage of this compilation, who evokes the peregrination of the Italian merchant Ludovico da Vartema, the travelers justify his specific treatment of Calicut, despite his description of many places in the Indies. So he said, I did not want to amuse myself for the sake of offending you by recounting the ways of life, the custom, the faith, the police, and the inhabitants of all these countries, but as a reward for this, I will talk to you extensively what I have seen in Calicut. This description of Calicut is clearly highlighted in the French version by the insertion of a typographically distinguished proem, as you see, in italics, which is different from the typograph of the rest of the text, which announced the description of the city of Calicut with the chief of India, so the capital of India, if we translate in modern languages. The account of the various armadas of the Indies construct Calicut as the primary object of desire and about which the information is more extensive. The centrality of Calicut is thus expressed by the place it occupies as shorthand for the East Indies in writings that are not primarily devoted to it. For example, no, I didn't put the quote, sorry. In a Spanish chronicle about the West Indies of Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, the few comparisons between American realities and those of the East Indies are made through the reference to Calicut. So indeed, in 1575, the polygrapher and cosmographer François de Belforêt could write in his Cosmographie universelle that there is hardly a man today who has not heard of Calicut, even though at that time the city was not as powerful and as important in the region as it was 1 century before. This knowledge also stems from the fact that the focus of the French translation often concentrate on the struggle between the Portuguese and the rulers of Calicut. For example, the French translation, the first French translation of a Portuguese text dealing with the arrival of the Portuguese is only about the first book of Lopes de Castaneda, who focused on the war that the Portuguese captains waged against the king of Calicut. A few years later, Martin Fumet, who translated a history of West Indies in 1569, draws also a list of distant writing, and he said, I had read other books, and Antoine Lopes de Castaneda, who described the descent of the Portuguese to Calicut. So Fumet reduces the book of Castaneda, which is much more than just that, to the Calicut setting. This quote introduces the next place I will talk about, Peru, because he introduced the usefulness of his own translation of Lopes de Gomara History of America, which became a central source for knowledge of America in the 16th century France. In order to justify his translation, Fumet writes that the work is appropriate for the turbulent time in which we were, so it was during the Wars of Religion in France, notably because the fourth part discussed extensively the civil wars which occurred between the Spaniards for the domination of the Kingdom of Peru. Implicitly, Fumet suggests that this example of a rift in the American between members of the same political society could be used by the French to understand the consequences of civil war in their own kingdoms. Fumet also helps to establish the centrality of another place, so the Peruvian referent, in 16th century French culture. Unlike Calicut, Peru is a new toponym, completely new toponym, appearing after the conquistadores' conquest of the Inca Empire in the early 1530s. As early as 1534, a slim news account published in Lyon, Les Nouvelles Certaines des Îles du Pérou, include the name Peru for the first time in a French print. In 1544, the first French translation of Pierre Appian Cosmography, already quoted, indicates, after a chapter devoted to America, an appendix where it's stated that the novelty of the discovery of this part of the world explained its recent adjunction to the cosmography. So in this appendix, he said that isn't it wonderful that new parts of the world are coming to our knowledge? And as you can see, in the South American part, there are few toponyms, and one of them is Peru. One of the texts that helps to anchor this reference is Jacques de Gory, translation of the anonymous account of a soldier of the expedition of Pizarro, originally published in 1534 in Seville and translated in 1545 or 6, a new style of dating maybe, in French. So with this title, The History of Newfoundland of Peru in West India, which is the main gold mine of the world. The translation is confronted with the need to elaborate a new geography and toponymy. The identification of the geographical limits of the regions barely explored by the Europeans is one of the main challenges in understanding these new spaces. And the longest headline from the translator here on the right of all the book is devoted specifically to identifying what the reference of Peru and Cusco precisely covers. This is the only headline in the entire translation that is directly addressed to the reader by the translator. So he said that not that all the countries subject to the king was named Peru after the main and best country, main part of this kingdom. Peru thus become literally a metonymy for a much larger region, and the name often refers to the walls of Spanish South America due to the establishment of the Viceroyalty of Peru. So this account is also accompanied by a map, but I've shown it yesterday, and you will ask not to use it, so I'm not discussing about the map now, even though it's interesting. The translation also helps anchor the reference associated with the region, namely its gold wealth, as stated in the title, of the translation, which is the main principal mine d'or du monde. This headline reinforces the translation choices made by Gori, emphasizing those elements of the text that refer to the riches and wonders of Peru. This fixation on gold, even though silver was the main metal production in the Andean spaces, can be found in a number of writings of the period, not only in France, obviously, such as those of the poet Dubartas, for example. In his poem about the creation of the world, there is a lot of several references to the golden pill. Gori's interest in gold is related to his alchemical preoccupation, demonstrating the link between different fields of knowledge and scriptural production. Gori also accentuated the novel dimension of the story of the Spanish soldiers, for example, reinforcing the value of the Spanish conquerors. It can be linked with Gori's involvement in chivalric literature. Gori was also one of the translators of the most popular chivalric novel in 16th century France, Amadis de Gaulle, originally published in Spain. Gori had to defend the dignity of this kind of story as a means to access to knowledge in the face of the discredit that many scholars brought to these writings, which were considered fabulous and frivolous. This defense is part of a world trend that values symbolic and allegorical readings of this novel of chivalry, which make it possible to propose a meditation on the world and to penetrate the secrets of the universe. The novelistic, fictional, and imaginary material does not hinder its claim to convey a certain truth about the world, and, for example, a cartographic or geographical truth. In the book 11, translated by Gori, is devoted to the description of an imaginary castle of Phoebus and Diane, with all its specific singularities and architecture. Gori transformed the summary description of the castle found in the Spanish original text into a real palace with a lot of other artificial places. Between the building of Jupiter and that of Mercury, an orchard unfolds with a fountain, which made several aisles through the orchard in the same way as the sea does in the world, departing from the region of the Earth, Europe, Asia, and Africa, like a true terrestrial and marine maps. The figures accompanying this depiction and the vignette underline the geographical dimension, such as the one illustrating here the castle. Admittedly, Gori is not referring to America here, as the heroes of the Amadis take part in the old world, but this example demonstrates the porosity between the actors of the different fields of knowledge. The translation of Gori also takes part to send back the people of Peru towards a primitivist and barbaric vision, in contradiction with other texts which underline the refinement of this society. In the preface, the translator recognized that the Indians which inhabit Peru are governed by order and civil institution, but anyway concludes that they are all on. He concludes, from it that they all almost a middle nature between the man and the beast. This motif of barbarian Peru it can be seen also in, for example, Dubartas, in another quotation, and can be illustrated again by the case of Ronsard, which I will conclude. Once again, evokes this kind of triad, Canada, Peru, and Calicut, in a prose text which has remained unpublished, devoted to intellectual and moral virtue, addresses to the French king. After enumerating some intellectual sciences that are only useful for the management of public affairs, He said that, do you see by our farmers who have never learned anything but the art of the plough, nonetheless they are live as good and honorable people. Those of the newly found lands in Canada, Peru, Calicut have no science, however they know how to keep by nature a friendship society, a good trade with each other. Even though the people of Calicut and Peru are part of literate and advanced civilization, these place names are used as a reductive and stereotypical evocators of distant people living in a state of nature. Thanks.